June 17, 1944, 0347 hours Saipan. Colonel Takashi Goto crouches behind the smoking wreckage of his Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tank. Around him 43 more Japanese tanks burn in the pre-dawn darkness. The 9th Tank Regiment, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army armored forces, was annihilated in a single night. Through the acrid smoke, Goto watches another wave of American M4A2 Sherman tanks rolling off landing craft, their 75mm guns traversing methodically. The machines keep coming. Always more machines. The colonel had known this moment would arrive, but the reality still staggered him. These were not just tanks, they were products of an industrial system that Japan could never match. Each Sherman represented not just superior firepower and armor, but the crushing weight of American mass production. In the time it took Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to build a single Type 97 Chi-Ha, Detroit's assembly lines had rolled out dozens of Shermans. The 2nd and 4th Marine Tank Battalions advancing through Saipan's volcanic terrain carried with them the accumulated power of roughly 50,000 tanks produced across 11 American factories. Japan's entire wartime tank production of barely 2,100 Type 97 medium tanks could be matched by a single month's output from the Detroit arsenal alone. The morning sun revealed the full scope of Japan's tactical and industrial defeat. Scattered across the coastal plain lay the remnants of what had been the largest Japanese tank attack in the Pacific War. The Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks, their 37mm guns useless against Sherman armor, had been reduced to burning hulks within minutes. The more modern Type 97 Shinhodo Chi-Ha tanks, equipped with high-velocity 47mm guns that represented Japan's most advanced anti-tank technology, had fared little better. Their rounds, capable of penetrating a Sherman's side armor under perfect conditions, had proven inadequate against the frontal protection of the American tanks. Behind the advancing Marines, more landing craft disgorged their mechanical cargo. M4A2 Shermans equipped with deep-water fording gear emerged from the surf like steel leviathans, their diesel engines coughing to life as crews disconnected snorkel tubes and wading trunks. The sight would have been science fiction to Japanese observers just 2 years earlier. Now it represented the new reality of mechanized warfare in the Pacific. The story of this overwhelming superiority began not in the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, but in the sprawling industrial complexes of Detroit, Michigan. In September 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged over England and Nazi armies swept across Europe, executives from Chrysler Corporation received an unexpected phone call. William Knudsen, the Danish-born industrialist who had transformed General Motors and now served as director of American defense production, had a simple question. Could Chrysler build tanks? The answer would reshape the war in the Pacific. K.T. Keller, Chrysler's chief executive, responded with characteristic American pragmatism. I do not know. I have never seen one of these things. Within months, however, Chrysler had broken ground on what would become the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, a purpose-built facility designed to apply automobile mass production techniques to armored vehicle manufacturing. The concept was revolutionary. No nation had ever attempted to produce tanks on the scale envisioned by American planners. The Detroit Arsenal, situated in Warren Township, just north of Detroit, represented more than just another defense facility. It embodied a fundamental shift in military thinking. Traditional European tank production relied on skilled craftsmen working with specialized tools to create vehicles essentially hand-built for quality over quantity. The American approach inverted this philosophy entirely. Henry Ford's assembly line principles, refined over decades of automobile production, would be applied to the most complex military vehicles ever conceived. Construction began in earnest as Michigan's harsh winter of 1940-41 gripped the region. Workers labored through freezing temperatures and spring mud as the massive facility took shape. The main building stretched 5 city blocks in length and 2 in width, designed to house 1,000 machine tools and over 8,000 specialized jigs. When completed, the Detroit Arsenal would employ nearly 5,500 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The scale defied comprehension. By early 1941, even before the factory walls were fully erected, the first M3 Lee medium tanks were rolling off incomplete assembly lines. Steam locomotives provided heat during the brutal Michigan winter as workers continued construction around operational production equipment. The sight of tanks being manufactured in a half-built factory with snow blowing through gaps in the walls captured the desperate urgency of American industrial mobilization. The transition from M3 Lee to M4 Sherman production marked a crucial evolution in American tank design philosophy. The Sherman incorporated lessons learned from early combat experiences while maintaining the production efficiency that made mass manufacturing possible. The M4A2 variant, equipped with twin General Motors 671 diesel engines producing 375 horsepower combined, would become the preferred tank of the United States Marine Corps. The diesel power plant offered significant advantages for Pacific operations: greater fuel efficiency, reduced fire hazard, and extended operational range. Detroit Arsenal represented only one node in an expanding network of American tank production. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, operated by General Motors, specialized in M4A2 production for both Marine Corps operations and Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. Ford Motor Company's Highland Park facility contributed additional Sherman variants while developing the powerful GAA V8 engine that would power later American tank designs. American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, and other manufacturers added their capacity to the growing industrial base. The production statistics told a story of unprecedented manufacturing achievement. In 1942, American factories produced about 4,000 Sherman tanks. By 1943, annual production had reached roughly 12,000 units. The peak year of 1944 saw about 17,000 Shermans roll off assembly lines across the United States. Total wartime production would reach roughly 49,000 tanks by 1945, with thousands more M4-based tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and specialized variants adding to the total. Each Sherman represented approximately 50,000 individual components sourced from hundreds of subcontractors across the American industrial base. Steel came from Pittsburgh's massive mills. The armor plate was rolled in Gary, Indiana. Engines were manufactured in Detroit's automotive plants. Optical equipment came from Rochester, New York. Radios were produced in Chicago. The entire continental United States had become a vast military-industrial machine dedicated to producing the implements of mechanized warfare. Japanese intelligence services tracked this buildup with growing alarm. Reports filtered back to Tokyo describing the scale of American tank production, but the figures seemed too fantastic to believe. How could any nation produce tanks in such quantities? Japanese planners, accustomed to the limited industrial capacity of their island nation, struggled to comprehend the implications of American mass production. Japan's own tank production efforts centered around the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Tokyo facility operated on an entirely different scale. The Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tank, first produced in 1938, represented the most advanced Japanese tank design to see widespread service. Between 1938 and 1943, Japanese industry managed to produce about 2,000 Type 97 tanks in all variants, a number that American factories could match in less than 6 weeks of peak production. The Type 97 Chi-Ha embodied Japanese tank design philosophy of the late 1930s. Weighing approximately 15 tons, it mounted either a low-velocity 57mm gun derived from the earlier Type 89 medium tank, or in later variants a high-velocity 47mm Type 1 anti-tank gun. The tank's armor ranged from 6mm to 25mm in thickness, adequate protection against Chinese forces during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but increasingly obsolete as the Pacific conflict escalated. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized infantry support over tank versus tank combat. The Type 97's design reflected this philosophy, with relatively thin armor and a low-velocity main gun optimized for destroying bunkers and machine gun nests rather than engaging enemy armor. This doctrinal decision, sensible given Japan's limited industrial capacity and the nature of warfare in China, would prove catastrophic when Japanese tank units encountered American Sherman tanks equipped with high-velocity 75mm guns and thick frontal armor. The industrial disparity extended beyond mere numbers to fundamental differences in production philosophy. American Sherman tanks incorporated standardized components that allowed easy field maintenance and rapid repair. Parts from tanks built by different manufacturers were largely interchangeable, simplifying logistics and reducing maintenance burdens. Japanese tanks built in smaller numbers with more artisanal methods often required specialized parts and tools for maintenance, complicating supply chains and reducing operational availability. By early 1944, American tank production had reached a steady rhythm that Japanese planners could no longer ignore. Intelligence estimates suggested that American forces would soon possess overwhelming armored superiority in any Pacific engagement. The implications were stark. Japanese defensive positions, no matter how well prepared, would face the concentrated firepower of hundreds of Sherman tanks, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. The reality of this industrial supremacy became apparent during the Marianas Campaign planning phase. Operation Forager, the American code name for the assault on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, represented the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific to date. The invasion force included over 500 ships carrying 300,000 men and massive quantities of equipment, including the 2nd and 4th Marine Tank Battalions with their complement of M4A2 Sherman tanks. Each Marine Tank Battalion had been reorganized by 1944 to maximize the effectiveness of medium tank support. Gone were the light tank companies that had characterized early Pacific operations. In their place, 3 medium tank companies provided 46 M4A2 Sherman tanks per battalion, along with specialized variants including the fearsome Satan flamethrower tanks developed specifically for reducing Japanese fortifications. The M4A2 Sherman tanks destined for Saipan represented the cutting edge of American armor technology adapted for Pacific conditions. Each tank weighed approximately 33 tons and carried a crew of 5 commander gunner, loader driver, and bow gunner. The main armament consisted of a 75mm M3L40 gun capable of firing armor-piercing high-explosive and specialized rounds. Secondary armament included a coaxial 30-caliber machine gun, a bow-mounted 30-caliber machine gun, and a 50-caliber machine gun mounted on the turret top for anti-aircraft defense. The Sherman's armor protection, while considered moderate by European standards, provided overwhelming superiority against Japanese anti-tank weapons. The frontal armor, ranging from 25mm to 76mm in thickness depending on location, was essentially impervious to Japanese 37mm and 47mm guns at normal combat ranges. Only the most modern Japanese anti-tank weapons firing at close range against the thinner side armor had any hope of penetrating a Sherman's protection. More importantly, the Sherman's 75mm gun could easily penetrate any Japanese tank armor at combat ranges. The M61 armor-piercing round, with its muzzle velocity of 617 meters per second, could punch through the heaviest Japanese tank armor with ease. The M48 high-explosive round proved equally devastating against Japanese fortifications and infantry positions. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces possessed both qualitative and quantitative armor superiority. The preparation for Saipan revealed the sophistication of American amphibious warfare techniques. Sherman tanks were equipped with specialized wading gear including waterproof seals and extended exhaust systems that allowed operation in up to 6 feet of water for 8 minutes. This capability enabled tanks to drive directly from landing craft to the beach, providing immediate armored support for infantry assault waves. The technical challenges of amphibious tank operations had been solved through typical American engineering innovation. Each Sherman was fitted with a detachable wading trunk that extended the engine air intake above water level. Waterproof electrical connections protected vital systems. Special sealing compounds prevented water infiltration into crew compartments and ammunition storage areas. The entire system could be installed by tank crews in the field, providing flexibility for varying beach conditions. Japanese defenders on Saipan observed the American preparations with growing apprehension. Aerial reconnaissance and submarine reports described a vast invasion fleet approaching the Marianas. The scale of the approaching armada dwarfed any previous Pacific operation. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the Central Pacific Area Fleet, had predicted American action in the Marianas, but even his pessimistic assessments had underestimated the scope of Operation Forager. The Japanese garrison on Saipan totaled approximately 30,000 troops, including elements of the 43rd Division and substantial naval forces. More critically for the coming tank battle, the island hosted elements of the 9th Tank Regiment under Colonel Takashi Goto. This regiment represented one of Japan's premier armored units equipped with the most modern tanks available to the Imperial Japanese Army. The 9th Tank Regiment had been distributed across the Mariana Islands as part of Japan's defensive strategy. The 1st and 2nd Companies were stationed on Guam, while the 3rd, 5th, and 6th Companies remained on Saipan. This dispersal reflected Japanese strategic thinking that emphasized defending multiple points rather than concentrating forces for a decisive engagement. The decision would prove fatal when American forces achieved overwhelming local superiority on each island in sequence. Colonel Goto's tank companies on Saipan possessed approximately 36 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks along with supporting Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks and various specialized vehicles. The Type 97 tanks included both original models mounting 57mm low-velocity guns and improved Shin-Hodo variants equipped with 47mm high-velocity anti-tank guns. The latter represented Japan's most advanced tank technology specifically designed to engage enemy armor. The Type 97 Shin-Hodo Chi-Ha mounted the Type 147mm tank gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating 55mm of armor at 500 meters range. Against the M3 Stuart light tanks that had characterized early American armored operations in the Pacific, this weapon was highly effective. Against the frontal armor of an M4 Sherman, however, the 47mm gun was largely useless except at point-blank range against specific weak points. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized concealment and ambush tactics rather than mobile operations. The volcanic terrain of Saipan with its rough coral outcroppings and dense vegetation seemed ideal for defensive tank operations. Japanese engineers had prepared carefully camouflaged positions that would allow their tanks to engage American forces from concealed locations before withdrawing to alternate positions. The fundamental flaw in Japanese planning lay not in tactics but in the industrial mathematics of modern warfare. No amount of tactical skill or defensive preparation could overcome the simple arithmetic of 46 American tanks per Marine battalion versus 36 Japanese tanks for the entire island garrison. When multiplied by the qualitative superiority of Sherman armor and firepower, the odds became insurmountable. The American invasion of Saipan began at 0542 hours on June 15, 1944, with a massive naval bombardment that shook the island to its foundations. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured thousands of shells into Japanese defensive positions while carrier aircraft added bombs, rockets, and napalm to the devastating barrage. The preliminary bombardment represented firepower on a scale never before seen in the Pacific War. At 0843 hours, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches along Saipan's western coast. The 2nd Marine Division landed on beaches designated red and green, while the 4th Marine Division assaulted yellow and blue beaches to the south. Fierce Japanese resistance met the assault waves, but American superiority in naval gunfire support and close air support gradually suppressed enemy defensive fires. The critical moment came in the afternoon when the 2nd and 4th Marine Tank Battalions began landing their M4A2 Sherman tanks. The sight of American armor emerging from the surf shocked Japanese observers who had grown accustomed to fighting only infantry and light supporting weapons. These were not the vulnerable M3 Stuart light tanks that had characterized early Pacific operations. These were medium tanks with thick armor and powerful guns. Each Sherman tank weighed more than 2 Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks combined. The 75mm M3 gun could destroy any Japanese tank with a single hit, while Japanese anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate Sherman armor even at close range. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Japanese infantry who had learned to deal with American light tanks through close assault tactics found themselves facing armored monsters that seemed impervious to their weapons. The technical superiority became apparent within hours of the landing. Sherman tanks advanced methodically through Japanese defensive positions, their thick frontal armor deflecting 37mm and 47mm anti-tank rounds with metallic clangs that echoed across the battlefield. The 75mm guns responded with devastating high-explosive rounds that obliterated bunkers and machine gun nests. For Japanese defenders, the Sherman tanks represented an almost supernatural level of protection and firepower. Marine tank infantry cooperation had evolved significantly since early Pacific operations. Tank commanders maintained radio contact with supporting infantry units, allowing coordinated assaults on Japanese strongpoints. Infantry marked targets with colored smoke, while tanks provided covering fire during advances. The combination proved devastatingly effective against Japanese defensive positions designed to stop infantry attacks but lacking adequate anti-tank defenses. By evening on June 15, American forces had established a substantial beachhead despite fierce Japanese resistance. The 2nd Marine Division controlled terrain north of Charn-Kanoa, while the 4th Marine Division had secured the area around Ajingan Point. More critically, both Marine Tank Battalions had successfully landed their full complement of M4A2 Sherman tanks and established forward maintenance areas. The successful landing triggered urgent conferences in Japanese command bunkers across Saipan. Colonel Goto and his tank company commanders studied intelligence reports describing the American armored forces with growing alarm. The Sherman tanks were larger, better armored, and more heavily armed than anything they had encountered. More disturbingly, there seemed to be unlimited numbers of them. Japanese military intelligence had consistently underestimated American tank production capabilities. Reports describing tens of thousands of tanks rolling off American assembly lines had been dismissed as propaganda. The reality now confronting Japanese commanders suggested that these impossible production figures might be accurate. If true, Japan faced an industrial gap that could never be closed through battlefield tactics alone. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the 43rd Division and overall Japanese forces on Saipan, faced a critical decision. Intelligence reports suggested that the American beachhead would be heavily reinforced during the night. Naval forces continued landing supplies and equipment while additional troops came ashore. If Japanese forces were to have any chance of driving the Americans back into the sea, they would need to attack immediately while the beachhead remained relatively limited. Colonel Goto received orders to prepare the 9th Tank Regiment for a coordinated night attack against the American positions. The plan called for Japanese armor to spearhead an assault by infantry elements of the 136th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Yukamatsu Ogawa. The combined force would strike at dawn on June 17, attempting to break through American lines and reach the invasion beaches where they could disrupt the continuing flow of men and supplies. The Japanese plan represented sound tactical thinking given the forces available. Night attacks had proven effective in previous Pacific engagements, often negating American advantages in air support and naval gunfire. Japanese infantry excelled at infiltration tactics under cover of darkness. The addition of armored support would provide the breakthrough power necessary to penetrate American defensive positions. What Japanese planners failed to adequately consider was the fundamental shift in American defensive capabilities represented by the Sherman tanks. Previous Pacific engagements had been primarily infantry affairs with limited armor support on either side. The massive presence of M4A2 tanks on Saipan created an entirely new tactical situation that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. American forces spent the night of June 16, 17 consolidating their beachhead and preparing for the expected Japanese counterattack. Marine commanders experienced in Pacific warfare recognized the signs of impending assault, decreased enemy activity during daylight hours, occasional probing attacks to test defensive positions, and the movement of supplies and personnel observed through gaps in Japanese camouflage. The 2nd and 4th Marine Tank Battalions dispersed their M4A2 Sherman tanks in defensive positions that maximized fields of fire while providing mutual support. Tank commanders received detailed briefings on likely Japanese approach routes and coordinated defensive fires with supporting artillery units. The Marines had learned hard lessons about Japanese night attack tactics and had adapted their defensive procedures accordingly. Marine tank crews spent the hours before dawn checking their vehicles and ammunition loads. Each Sherman carried 95 rounds of 75mm ammunition in various types of armor piercing for engaging Japanese tanks, high explosive for bunkers and infantry positions, and specialized rounds including white phosphorus for marking targets and creating smoke screens. The coaxial and bow machine guns were loaded with 4,750 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition, while the turret-mounted 50 caliber machine gun carried 300 rounds for anti-aircraft defense and personnel targets. The M4A2's twin diesel engines provided several advantages for night defensive operations. The diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, reducing fire hazards if the tank was hit. The engines produced less visible exhaust signature, making the tanks harder to locate in darkness. Most importantly, the diesel power plant was more fuel efficient, allowing extended operations without refueling, critical for sustained defensive fighting. At 0200 hours on June 17, American listening posts detected movement in the Japanese lines. Marine commanders alerted their units and confirmed defensive preparations. Artillery forward observers coordinated with tank commanders to ensure integrated fires when the attack began. The stage was set for the largest tank engagement in the Pacific War. Colonel Goto's force advanced through the pre-dawn darkness with careful attention to noise discipline. The Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks moved in single file along predetermined routes, their crews navigating by compass and terrain features visible in the faint starlight. Supporting infantry elements infiltrated between the tank columns preparing to exploit any breakthrough achieved by the armored spearhead. The Japanese attack plan called for a coordinated assault by 44 tanks, 36 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, and 8 Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks supported by approximately 1,000 infantry. The armor would punch through American defensive lines while infantry forces exploited the gaps to reach the invasion beaches. Once their Japanese forces could disrupt the continuing American buildup and potentially force a withdrawal. At 0347 hours, the attack began. The first Japanese tank to crest the ridgeline north of the marine perimeter immediately drew fire from 3 M4A2 Sherman tanks positioned in defensive positions below. The 75mm armor-piercing rounds struck the Type 97's frontal armor with devastating effect, penetrating completely and detonating the ammunition storage. The Japanese tank exploded in a brilliant fireball that illuminated the surrounding terrain and marked targets for additional American tanks. Within minutes, the night erupted in violence as Japanese tanks poured over the ridgeline into the killing ground that Marine commanders had prepared. Sherman tanks positioned with overlapping fields of fire engaged the advancing Japanese armor with systematic precision. The superior optical equipment in American tanks, including periscopes and telescopic sights, allowed accurate shooting in the limited visibility, while Japanese tanks struggled to acquire targets. The technical disparity became immediately apparent. Japanese 47mm guns fired repeatedly at the approaching Sherman tanks, their muzzle flashes revealing positions to American tank commanders. Round after round bounced harmlessly off Sherman frontal armor with distinctive metallic impacts that could be heard above the general din of battle. Meanwhile, every 75mm round fired by the American tanks found its mark with devastating effect. Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks designed for infantry support rather than tank combat proved completely helpless against Sherman armor and firepower. Their 37mm guns could not penetrate Sherman armor at any range, while the American 75mm guns destroyed them with single hits. Several Japanese light tanks became bogged down in shell craters and marshy ground, making them stationary targets for methodical destruction. The Type 97 Shinhodo Chi-Ha tanks, representing Japan's most modern armor technology, fared little better. Their high-velocity 47mm guns could theoretically penetrate Sherman side armor at close range, but the defensive positions chosen by Marine tank commanders prevented flanking attacks. Forced to engage frontally, the Japanese tanks found their most powerful weapons useless against American armor protection. Marine tank commanders maintained radio communication throughout the engagement, coordinating fires and sharing target information. This technological advantage, standard in American forces but limited in Japanese units, allowed rapid concentration of firepower against individual targets. Multiple Sherman tanks would engage single Japanese vehicles, ensuring quick kills and preventing effective return fire. The slaughter continued for 47 minutes. Japanese tanks burned across the volcanic landscape as their crews attempted desperate close assault tactics that had worked against infantry positions but proved suicidal against entrenched armor. Some Type 97 tanks managed to approach within 50 meters of American positions before being destroyed by point-blank 75mm fire that completely penetrated their armor and ignited fuel and ammunition. Supporting Japanese infantry found themselves caught in the open without adequate cover when their tank support was eliminated. Sherman tanks turned their machine guns and high-explosive rounds against personnel targets with devastating effect. The coordinated assault deteriorated into individual attempts at infiltration that Marine riflemen contained with relative ease. By 0434 hours, the Japanese attack had been completely shattered. 31 Japanese tanks lay burning across the battlefield, their crews dead or desperately attempting to escape the wreckage. The remaining Japanese tanks were hunted down and destroyed over the following days as American forces expanded their beachhead. The destruction was so complete that Marine commanders initially questioned the intelligence reports describing it. How could an entire tank regiment be eliminated in less than an hour? The evidence lay scattered across the approaches to the beachhead smoking hulks of Japanese armor that had been systematically destroyed by American firepower superiority. Colonel Goto, wounded but alive, managed to escape the destruction of his command tank. Hidden in a shell crater as dawn broke over Saipan, he witnessed the full extent of the disaster. The 9th Tank Regiment, the pride of Japanese armored forces, had been annihilated in a single engagement. The cream of Japan's tank crews trained over months and years were dead or wounded. The tanks themselves, representing irreplaceable production capacity, were twisted wreckage. Marine maintenance crews immediately began recovery operations using specialized M32 tank recovery vehicles to salvage damaged Sherman tanks for repair. Components from destroyed vehicles were cannibalized to maintain operational tanks. The logistical system that supported American armor included repair facilities, spare parts inventories, and replacement vehicles that Japanese forces could never match. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, additional M4A2 Sherman tanks were being unloaded from landing ships to replace any American losses. The 2nd and 4th Marine Tank Battalions maintained their full operational strength despite the intense fighting. For Japanese observers, this rapid replacement capability demonstrated the futility of attrition tactics against American forces. The intelligence windfall from captured Japanese tanks provided American technical specialists with detailed information about enemy armor capabilities. Examination of Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks revealed the limitations of Japanese metallurgy and manufacturing techniques. The armor quality was inconsistent, welding was often poor, and mechanical components showed signs of material shortages that affected reliability. Most revealing was the discovery of technical manuals and tactical documents that detailed Japanese anti-tank training and doctrine. These materials showed that Japanese forces had been preparing to fight the M3 Stuart light tanks that characterized early American Pacific operations. The shift to Sherman medium tanks had caught Japanese planners completely unprepared both tactically and technically. The psychological impact on Japanese forces across Saipan was immediate and profound. Infantry units that had been told they could stop American tanks with close assault tactics now witnessed the complete failure of their most powerful armored support. The invincibility that Japanese propaganda had claimed for their forces was shattered along with the burning hulks of the 9th Tank Regiment. American forces exploited their victory with characteristic efficiency. Sherman tanks spearheaded advances that systematically reduced Japanese defensive positions across the island. The combination of tank firepower, artillery support, and close air support proved irresistible against Japanese fortifications designed primarily to resist infantry attacks. Marine tank crews developed innovative tactics for reducing Japanese bunkers and cave positions. High explosive rounds from 75mm guns could collapse cave entrances or kill defenders through concussion effects. The specialized Satan flamethrower tanks proved particularly effective against fortified positions, projecting streams of burning fuel into defensive works that were impervious to conventional weapons. The technical evolution of American armor continued even during the Saipan fighting. Lessons learned from the tank engagement led to immediate modifications in tactics and equipment. Tank commanders requested additional high-explosive ammunition for bunker-busting missions. Communication procedures were refined to improve coordination between tank units and supporting infantry. Maintenance protocols were updated based on operational experience in tropical conditions. The strategic implications of the Saipan tank battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese military planners in Tokyo received detailed reports describing the one-sided nature of the engagement. The stark reality could no longer be ignored. American industrial capacity had achieved decisive superiority in every category of military equipment. The production statistics told an unforgiving story. In the time required for Japan to manufacture a single Type 97 Chi-Ha tank, American factories produced dozens of Sherman tanks. Detroit Arsenal alone could outproduce Japan's entire tank industry by a factor of 10 to 1. When multiplied across 11 American tank production facilities, the disparity became mathematically insurmountable. Japanese military intelligence finally acknowledged what industrial analysts had been reporting for 2 years. American tank production had reached levels that defied traditional military mathematics. The concept of mass production as applied to complex military equipment was fundamentally alien to Japanese manufacturing philosophy, which emphasized quality craftsmanship over quantity production. The cultural dimensions of this industrial gap reflected deeper differences between American and Japanese approaches to warfare. American doctrine emphasized material superiority and technological advantages to minimize casualties among their own forces. Japanese doctrine relied on spiritual factors and individual sacrifice to overcome material disadvantages. The Saipan tank battle demonstrated the futility of the latter approach when facing overwhelming industrial superiority. Colonel Goto, recovering from his wounds in a field hospital, attempted to write a report that could convey the magnitude of the disaster to his superiors. How could he explain that an entire tank regiment had been destroyed in less than an hour? How could he describe the psychological impact of watching Japanese anti-tank rounds bounce harmlessly off American armor? How could he communicate the industrial implications of an enemy that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them? The broader Pacific War context made the Saipan defeat even more ominous for Japanese planners. Operation Forager was only one of multiple American offensives grinding forward across the Pacific. Each operation brought more Sherman tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, and more evidence of American industrial dominance. The material cost of each American victory was rapidly replaced by production that operated on a scale Japan could never match. The fate of the 9th Tank Regiment became a cautionary tale within Japanese military circles. Other tank units across the Pacific received orders to avoid direct engagements with American armor except under the most favorable circumstances. Tank commanders were instructed to use their vehicles as mobile artillery and bunkers rather than seeking tank versus tank combat that they could not win. The doctrinal shift represented a fundamental acknowledgement of defeat in the technological realm. Japanese forces would continue to fight with desperate courage for another 14 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American industrial capacity, exemplified by the Sherman tanks that continued rolling off assembly lines by the thousands, had achieved decisive superiority that could not be overcome by tactical skill or individual heroism. The cleanup operations following the tank battle provided additional evidence of American industrial dominance. Marine engineers used bulldozers, another product of American mass production, to clear the wreckage of Japanese tanks from key terrain. The destroyed vehicles were pushed into mass graves that became monuments to the industrial war Japan could not win. Within days of the battle, American intelligence specialists had cataloged every piece of Japanese equipment for technical evaluation. Photograph specifications and metallurgical samples were shipped back to research facilities in the United States for detailed analysis. This systematic approach to intelligence gathering reflected the scientific methodology that characterized American military operations. The captured Japanese technical documents revealed additional dimensions of enemy weakness. Production reports showed declining quality in Japanese armor steel due to material shortages. Maintenance manuals described expedient repairs using substandard components. Training materials reflected the desperate attempts to prepare crews for equipment they would never receive in adequate quantities. Most telling were the Japanese intelligence estimates of American production capacity. Even the most pessimistic Japanese assessments had underestimated American tank production by factors of 5 to 10. The true scale of American industrial mobilization was simply beyond the comprehension of planners accustomed to Japan's limited manufacturing base. The strategic momentum generated by the Saipan victory accelerated American offensive operations across the Pacific. Within weeks of the tank battle, American forces were preparing assaults on Tinian and Guam that would complete the conquest of the Mariana Islands. Each operation brought more evidence of American material superiority and Japanese industrial inadequacy. The psychological effect on Japanese civilian leadership was equally devastating. When news of the Saipan defeat reached Tokyo, it triggered the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his cabinet. For the first time, the Japanese government acknowledged publicly that the war situation had become critical. The admission represented the beginning of Japan's acceptance that ultimate defeat was inevitable. The technical lessons learned from the Saipan tank battle influenced American armor development for the remainder of the war. Engineering improvements based on operational experience led to enhanced Sherman variants with better armor protection, more powerful guns, and improved mechanical reliability. The industrial base that had produced the original Sherman tanks adapted rapidly to incorporate battlefield lessons into new production. The maintenance and logistics achievements at Saipan demonstrated another dimension of American industrial superiority. Tank recovery vehicles, spare parts inventories, and repair facilities kept American armor operational at rates that Japanese forces could never match. The ability to maintain equipment in combat conditions reflected the depth of American industrial planning and resource allocation. Marine tank crews who had participated in the destruction of the 9th Tank Regiment became instructors for subsequent Pacific operations. Their combat experience was systematically analyzed and incorporated into training programs that prepared new crews for the continuing offensive against Japan. The institutional learning process represented another manifestation of American systematic approaches to warfare. Japanese anti-tank defenses had been effectively eliminated in the single-night engagement that destroyed their armored reserves. Remaining defensive positions lacked the weapons necessary to stop American armor, reducing Japanese forces to desperate infantry tactics that proved increasingly futile. The civilian population of Saipan witnessed the final proof of American military dominance as Sherman tanks rolled through areas that had been considered impregnable Japanese strongholds. The psychological impact on civilians who had been told of Japanese invincibility was devastating. Many chose suicide rather than face capture by forces they had been taught to fear. The strategic air implications of the Saipan victory became apparent within months of the island's capture. B-29 superfortresses operating from newly constructed airfields began strategic bombing campaigns against the Japanese home islands that had been impossible from more distant bases. The industrial capacity that had produced 50,000 Sherman tanks now supported bomber production on an equally massive scale. The mathematical progression was inexorable. American factories that could produce thousands of tanks per month were now building hundreds of four-engine bombers. The same industrial philosophy that had created overwhelming armor superiority was being applied to strategic aviation, naval construction, and artillery production. Japan faced an enemy whose production capacity expanded even as their own manufacturing base contracted under bombing and resource shortages. Colonel Goto eventually evacuated from Saipan during the final American assault and carried with him the bitter knowledge of Japan's industrial defeat. His detailed reports describing the one-sided tank battle provided Japanese military planners with stark evidence of American material superiority. The implications were clear. Continuation of the war would only increase the scale of Japanese defeats as American production continued to expand. The tank battle at Saipan marked a turning point in Pacific War dynamics that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. It demonstrated conclusively that American industrial capacity had achieved levels that made ultimate victory inevitable regardless of Japanese tactical skill or individual courage. The 9th Tank Regiment's destruction became a symbol of Japan's broader industrial inadequacy in the face of American mass production. The final irony of the engagement lay in its strategic futility for Japanese forces. Even if Colonel Goto's attack had succeeded in destroying every American tank on Saipan, replacement vehicles would have arrived within days from the inexhaustible American production base. The attack could have achieved only temporary tactical success against an enemy whose industrial resources made long-term resistance futile. The morning of June 17, 1944 revealed to Japanese observers the full magnitude of their strategic predicament. Across the smoking battlefield lay the wreckage of Japan's finest tank regiment destroyed in less than an hour by an enemy whose production capacity exceeded their entire industrial base. The sight crystallized the mathematical reality that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. In the final analysis, the tank battle at Saipan represented more than a military engagement. It was an industrial verdict delivered by assembly lines in Detroit, Michigan to a Japanese empire that had underestimated the productive capacity of American democracy. The 31 burning tanks scattered across Saipan's volcanic terrain were monuments to an industrial war that Japan had already lost before the first shot was fired. The legacy of that dawn engagement would echo through the remaining months of the Pacific War as American Sherman tanks produced by the thousands in factories that operated around the clock systematically reduced Japanese defensive positions across the Pacific. Each tank carried with it the accumulated power of American industrial democracy, a force that proved more decisive than any individual weapon or tactical innovation in determining the ultimate outcome of humanity's greatest conflict.